Just after dawn in late August of 2016, 34-year-old graduate photography student Rachel Monroe eased her silver compact car into the nearly empty lot at Red Rock Canyon just west of Las Vegas. She told her roommate Kelly she'd be home by Sunday night, back in time for laundry lesson plans and another week of normal life. By Monday morning, Rachel's bed was still made. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her car never pulled into their apartment complex. Kelly waded through the first class Rachel was supposed to teach, then drove the route she knew by heart out toward the red cliffs of the Nevada desert. There in the visitor lot sat Rachel's car in a regular parking space, baking in the heat exactly where it shouldn't still be. No broken glass, no sign of a struggle. Just a locked vehicle and an empty seat where a camera bag should have come to rest hours earlier. That afternoon, the county sheriff's office opened a missing person report and search teams began combing the canyons. For 3 weeks, helicopters swept over sandstone ridges and volunteers walked mile after mile of loose rock and cactus. They found nothing. No backpack, no tripod, no footprints they could be sure were hers. It was as if the desert had simply erased her. 4 months later, nearly 2 miles from any marked trail, a rock climbing instructor named Daniel Hayes paused at the base of a cliff and noticed something fluttering high in the twisted arms of an old Joshua tree fabric, weather-faded and out of place in the cold, clear air. He didn't know it yet, but he was looking at the first real evidence in Rachel Monroe's disappearance. If you're listening to this, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever felt uneasy alone in the wilderness, share your experience in the comments. By the summer of 2016, Rachel Monroe had carved out a steady, almost predictable rhythm to her life in Nevada. At 34, she was finishing her graduate work in photography at Desert State University, a program known for sending students into the rugged landscapes around Clark County. Friends described her as the kind of person who did things deliberately, packing the night before a shoot, charging every battery twice, and leaving notes on the kitchen counter so her roommate always knew where she'd gone. She shared a small 2-bedroom apartment in West Las Vegas with Kelly Dawson, a paralegal a few years younger, who admired Rachel's quiet discipline. Kelly often joked that Rachel treated the desert the way some people treated the ocean, respectfully, never assuming it would forgive carelessness. The two women had built an easy routine. Rachel spent early mornings scouting light and late evenings editing in silence, while Kelly moved in and out of the apartment like a breeze always in motion. There was comfort in that balance. Rachel's professors viewed her as unusually methodical for a creative field, someone who could spend hours studying topography maps before deciding where to stand for a sunrise shot. One of those professors, Dr. Sharon Whitfield, had met with her the previous week as Rachel prepared a final project documenting the collision between natural desert formations and the suburban glow of Las Vegas. To capture the contrast, she imagined she needed elevation distance and the sharp, low-angle light that lasted only minutes after dawn. Red Rock Canyon, with its sandstone ridges and open washes, offered everything she was looking for. Those who knew the area understood its allure. Just 20 miles from Las Vegas Boulevard, the canyon felt like another world, a carved, wind-scoured landscape that shifted from silent blues to burning reds as the sun rose. Locals were used to seeing photographers out there, especially in summer when the shadows stretched long across the basin. But the canyon had its own rules, too. Stray from the marked paths, and the terrain hardened quickly. Loose rock deceptive ledges and cacti that grew in ways that obscured natural drop-offs. Cell coverage faltered the farther one moved from the visitor loop. Search and rescue teams had said for years that in the Mojave, a person could be less than 100 yards from a trail and still vanish from sight. Rachel knew all of this. She'd logged dozens of hikes in similar terrain and never underestimated the heat or the distances. Her car always held extra water. Her phone stayed charged. Her camera gear was packed the same way every time, down to the way she wrapped her lenses in soft cloth before loading them into her backpack. Nothing in her habits suggested risk-taking. In the days leading up to her planned shoot, Rachel had reviewed sunrise angles, checked weather reports, and studied the visitor center's elevation charts. She intended to follow a well-known route for about a mile, then step off trail only far enough to reach a vantage point she'd marked on her map. According to Kelly, she had left home before dawn that Saturday, with a thermos of coffee, 3 bottles of water, and her camera bag slung across her shoulder, a routine she had repeated many times before. Still, something about that morning felt different to Kelly, though she couldn't explain why later. Maybe it was the way Rachel paused at the door as if replaying mental steps, or the quietness of the apartment at that hour. But Rachel didn't voice any concerns, and Kelly simply wished her luck with the big shot she'd been talking about all month. Red Rock Canyon in August presented a paradox stunning at sunrise, dangerous by noon. Even on cooler days, the temperature could leap 20 degrees in a single hour. Hikers learned early to read shadows, to understand how quickly a wash could heat, and how easily someone could drift off the trail while chasing better light. Rangers regularly reminded visitors that the desert's stillness could be deceptive. Sound didn't travel well in the canyons. Cries for help often bounced and died before reaching open air. But none of that seemed unusual or threatening to Rachel. She arrived at the visitor center sometime after 5:30 a.m., according to the attendant on duty. Her car pulled into a marked space, nothing rushed or out of place. She stepped out wearing a hat, a long-sleeved hiking shirt, and a backpack that looked full but neatly arranged. She paused at the trail map for several minutes, long enough to suggest she wasn't in a hurry, then walked toward the route she'd planned. A little after 7 a.m., a family visiting from Arizona crossed paths with her near a cluster of red sandstone shelves. They remembered her only because she politely asked for a moment to finish a shot before they stepped into her frame. She seemed confident, alone, and entirely comfortable with the surroundings. No one else reported seeing her afterward. By the time noon approached, the canyon floor would have been well over 100 degrees. Rangers believed Rachel intended to be back at her car long before that, editing photos at home by afternoon. When she didn't return, when she didn't answer calls, when her car remained locked in the same place, those small details began to build an uneasy picture. That Sunday evening, Kelly waited awake for the sound of Rachel's keys in the door. By Monday morning, when Rachel failed to appear for her teaching duties at the university, that picture tilted sharply from worry toward fear. Nothing about Rachel's life suggested she would wander aimlessly, travel without telling anyone, or ignore responsibilities. And the terrain she chose, one she understood well, wasn't known for swallowing prepared hikers outright. But whatever happened that morning took place beyond the view of the marked trail, beyond where most visitors ventured, in a section of desert where the land itself could hide evidence for months at a time. That was the world Rachel stepped into on August 12, 2016. A familiar landscape that, for reasons still unclear at that moment in the story, would not let her come back out. When Rachel Monroe stepped onto that trail just after sunrise on August 12, 2016, nothing seemed unusual, not to the family who passed her, not to rangers, not to the few early hikers who saw her car in the lot. The morning began the way many desert mornings do, quiet still, the air holding on to the last of the night's cooler breath before the heat arrived. By noon, the temperature in Red Rock Canyon had reached 104 degrees, and Rachel should have been long gone back home, uploading images and cooling down in the air conditioning. But she never returned to her car. And when Sunday evening slipped into night with no sign of her, the first shadow of fear began creeping in. Kelly, her roommate, stayed up waiting. She tried calling at least a dozen times, pacing the living room, trying to tell herself that maybe Rachel decided to photograph sunset as well. But the hours kept closing in. Each call rang twice, then tripped straight to voicemail. By Monday morning, when Rachel failed to show up at Desert State University for her teaching assignment, the concern became something heavier, something sharper. Kelly called the professor supervising her, then drove toward Red Rock Canyon, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She found the silver compact still parked exactly where Rachel had left it, unmoved, locked and sitting under the blistering desert sun, as if time around it had simply stopped. There was no sign that anyone had tried to get inside. No indication of trouble, just a vehicle waiting for its owner to return. That moment, Rachel's car alone in a vast, echoing parking lot was the first real confirmation that something was terribly wrong. Kelly contacted the Clark County Sheriff's Office immediately. By early afternoon, deputies arrived, followed closely by search and rescue teams. Even before they stepped onto the trail, the weight of the desert seemed to press in the heat radiating off the asphalt. The silence between gusts of wind, the endless stretches of sandstone rising like barricades around them. The official search began that same day. Rangers started with the most likely scenario, an injured hiker somewhere off the main path waiting to be found. They knew the terrain well. They understood how easy it was to slip on loose rock, twist an ankle, or underestimate the distance between landmarks. But Rachel was experienced, prepared, and careful. She wasn't known for pushing beyond her limits. Still, they began the standard grid pattern, methodical and wide. Teams spread out across the Calico Basin, calling her name, scanning every ledge and wash. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the ridges looking for heat signatures, anything that could resemble a human form. The desert answered with silence. By nightfall, no tracks, no dropped equipment, no movement had been found. Day 2 brought far more urgency. Heat hung over the canyon like a curtain, making every hour dangerous for both searchers and anyone who might be stranded. Additional teams arrived. Volunteers, park rangers, dog handlers, expanding the perimeter in all directions. Search dogs worked early before temperatures pushed them past safe limits, but even they struggled. The desert wind erased scent quickly, and the trails were crowded with footprints from hikers passing through before the search began. The dogs alerted to several areas along the main trail, but none pointed to where Rachel might have gone after the family saw her. A few faint impressions in the sand suggested someone had stepped off the trail in different locations, but they couldn't be tied to her with confidence. All were compromised by wind time and the footsteps of others. Each uncertain clue created a new question, and each new question deepened the unease. By the end of the first week, more than 50 square miles had been searched. Canyons, cliff bases, narrow washes, exposed ridges, even small caves and overhangs where someone could have sought shelter. Skilled climbers examined the steeper formations, rappelling into areas normally inaccessible to casual hikers. Nothing. No water bottle, no clothing, no broken lens, no sign she had ever left the main trail. Investigators felt the absence like a weight. In most missing hiker cases, even tragic ones, something is found: early footprints, a hat, a dropped item, a signal fire, a torn piece of fabric. Evidence usually follows movement, and movement always leaves a trace. But here the desert held its secrets tightly. Rachel's car was impounded and examined. Inside, detectives saw her purse in the glove compartment, sunblock, and spare batteries in the console receipts from earlier that week. Nothing unusual, and nothing out of place. Her backpack and camera gear were nowhere in the vehicle, a confirmation she had taken them with her just as she always did. Her phone records added one more disquieting detail: the last successful connection occurred at 8:42 a.m., after she had already been hiking for more than an hour. It wasn't a call. It was simply a brief moment when her device caught a signal near the canyon. After that, silence, a silence that stretched for months. As news of the disappearance spread, volunteers from Las Vegas and Henderson joined the search, some bringing their own ATVs, others carrying extra water for the crews. The community knew the canyon's reputation: breathtaking but unforgiving. People wanted to help, but even well-meaning volunteers could complicate search patterns, so rangers kept a tight structure, assigning areas and documenting every sweep. Multiple reported sightings came in from the public. Someone thought they saw a woman with a camera 2 miles north of the trailhead. Another person believed they passed her later in the day near a ridge overlook. Investigators followed each tip, retracing routes, interviewing hikers, checking timestamps on photos people had taken during their own outings. None of the reports held up. Visitors often misremembered trails. Many women carried cameras in Red Rock Canyon. And by the time rangers reached the locations described, any footprints had long since blended into the sand. The only confirmed sighting remained the Arizona family who encountered her near the sandstone shelves shortly after 7 a.m. Everything after that existed in a blank space. Rachel's parents arrived from Colorado within days. They walked the trailhead every morning, staring at the landscape as if trying to will an answer into view. They met daily with detectives asking the questions families always ask in these moments. Could she be lost? Could someone have helped her? What if she left the park somehow? Detectives tried to explain the reality. Red Rock Canyon was vast but contained. Most routes eventually looped back to the same few access points. People didn't simply walk out unnoticed, not with that heat, not with that terrain. Still, her family held on to any possibility, even those outside logic. Hope is a stubborn companion. By the third week, morale among search teams began to waver. The desert extracted its cost. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, twisted ankles, scraped palms from climbing over jagged rock. Rangers adjusted schedules to protect crews, shifting operations to early morning and late evening hours, but the toll was visible. Some volunteers cried quietly when they returned to the staging area. Others grew frustrated, asking aloud how someone as prepared as Rachel could vanish so completely. Detectives shared that question. When official search operations scaled back after 2 weeks, the case did not close. It simply grew heavier. The sheriff's department continued periodic sweeps, and they logged every public lead, no matter how small. But without evidence, no clothing, no equipment, no signs of foul play, investigators had no direction. She wasn't found in any ravine. She wasn't rescued by another hiker. She didn't walk out of the park. And nothing in her life suggested she would leave by choice. As September and October passed, the heat eased and the desert cooled. Families returned to hiking trails. Photographers came for autumn light. But for Rachel's family, and for many in the community, the canyon now held a quiet tension, a reminder that someone was missing somewhere in those ridges. Eventually, her parents returned home. They stayed in constant contact with detectives, but the weight of waiting became part of their daily lives. They kept a light on in their porch window as if she might walk up the steps any evening. In the sheriff's office, the file was moved from the active search board to the long-term cases section, still open, still monitored, but without new leads. 4 months had passed since she vanished. 4 months of empty trails, unanswered questions, and a desert that refused to give anything back. And then, on a cold, clear morning in mid-December, a climbing instructor paused beneath a cliff and noticed a scrap of fabric caught high in a Joshua tree, weather-faded, unmoving out of place. The silence that had held for months was about to break. By December, the desert around Red Rock Canyon had transformed. The blistering heat that swallowed search teams in August had given way to cold, open air, thin quiet, almost unnervingly clear. Winter in the Mojave carries a different kind of silence, the kind that feels ancient, as if the land itself is holding its breath. 4 months had passed since Rachel Monroe disappeared. Her case, once urgent and all-consuming, now sat in a quiet corner of the Clark County Sheriff's Office, still open, still watched, but without motion. The search had stopped producing leads. Family and volunteers had gone home, and the canyon, in its vast indifference, offered no answers. Then, on December 18th, something shifted. That morning, a group from a Las Vegas climbing school, 6 students and their lead instructor, 41-year-old Mark Halstead, hiked into a remote corridor northeast of the main trail system. It was an area few regular hikers ever reached, a place where sandstone walls rose like bookends and narrow washes cut deep into the earth. For Halstead, the terrain was familiar. He'd guided in this canyon for over a decade, long enough to know every crack in the walls, every slope that held just enough grip for a day's challenge. The cold air made the climb easier, the kind of winter morning when rope work felt crisp and predictable. While his students sorted gear at the base of a 60-foot wall, Halstead paused. Something in his periphery, a flicker of movement or maybe just color out of place, drew his attention upward. Wedged high in the branches of an old Joshua tree, its limbs twisted like arthritic fingers, a scrap of fabric swayed gently in the breeze. Trash in trees wasn't unusual. Desert winds could lift plastic bags or clothing from miles away. But this fabric was different, muted, weather-worn, and heavier than something that had simply blown loose. Halstead frowned. The tree sat on a narrow ledge halfway up the cliff face, its branches stretching outward into the cold air. Whatever was caught there hadn't drifted in lightly. He lifted his binoculars. What he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't just fabric. It was clothing, attached to something. Something with weight. Halstead lowered the binoculars and stepped back, steadying his breath. He had seen enough recoveries and wilderness training to recognize what he might be looking at. He signaled to his group, instructing them to stay put, then reached for the satellite communicator clipped to his harness. He didn't bother with long explanations. He simply said, "You need to send a team. Now." Clark County Search and Rescue arrived within hours, joined by National Park Service rangers and Detective Samuel Pike, the investigator who had remained assigned to Rachel's case even as the leads thinned. Pike knew every line in her file, every false sighting, every theory that collapsed under scrutiny. When he heard the location of Halstead's report, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months, a reluctant, fragile spark of possibility. The site was difficult to reach. The Joshua tree grew from a narrow shelf in the cliff, its roots gripping the rock like claws. Direct ascent was impossible without ropes, and approaching from above carried its own hazards. Winter daylight was short. Wind had picked up. But the team worked quickly, establishing anchor points and sending their most experienced climber, Officer Dana Liu, over the edge. As Liu descended, the tree came fully into view. The fabric, barely moving now, clung to the branches with an unnatural stillness. She eased herself closer, careful not to disturb anything. And then the shape resolved. It was a body. Weathered. Secured by the branches nearly 18 feet above the canyon floor. A position no fall could explain. The clothing, faded from months of exposure, looked consistent with hiking attire. A strap, possibly from a camera, still looped around the neck area. Desert air had preserved the remains in ways both merciful and unsettling, but enough features remained to suggest the victim was a woman close to Rachel's age. Liu radioed down, "It's human remains. We need to treat this as a recovery." On the ground, the canyon exhaled into silence. Detective Pike already suspected the truth, but official identification required time. The remains were brought down piece by piece, documented, photographed, preserved. The process stretched into late afternoon, the desert growing colder as shadows climbed the canyon walls. The area beneath the tree revealed no recent disturbances, no drag marks, no signs of a fall. The surrounding terrain offered no easy access point. Whoever had reached that spot either climbed with skill or navigated the cliffs in ways few hikers ever attempted. More troubling was what wasn't there. No backpack. No tripod, no camera. None of the equipment Rachel carried into the canyon that August morning. Pike felt the weight of it. This was no lost hiker, no accident victim. Rachel had been placed in that tree, deliberately, and with purpose. When the remains reached the county medical examiner, the emotional storm traveled with them. Rachel's parents were notified carefully, cautiously, with the acknowledgement that formal confirmation was still pending. They had spent months suspended between hope and dread. This call pulled that suspended world sharply downward. Within 48 hours, dental records confirmed the truth: the remains belonged to Rachel Monroe. Her disappearance was no longer a mystery of the lost. It was now a confirmed homicide. Investigators revisited the discovery site with renewed urgency. What had once seemed like an unlikely location now carried meaning, a place 2 miles from any marked trail, hidden between ridges, accessible only to those who understood the terrain deeply. The branches of the Joshua tree had held Rachel's body through storms and wind, preserving the secret of her final moments far longer than anyone expected. But the manner of placement raised immediate questions. If she had fallen, the tree would not have caught her so neatly. If she had climbed, the position made no sense. If she had collapsed nearby, she would not have ended up 18 feet above the ground. Nothing about the scene matched an accident. The desert, which had once seemed indifferent, now seemed complicit in hiding something intentional. The discovery created shockwaves first among investigators, then within the local community, and finally across the wider region. People who hiked Red Rock Canyon regularly were stunned. The idea that someone could be murdered and hidden in such a visible yet unreachable place unsettled even those who knew the desert well. Detective Pike revisited every assumption made in August. The previous theories, heat-related disorientation, accidental fall, medical emergency, fell away. The scene suggested planning strength and familiarity with the canyon's most difficult terrain. And the absence of equipment suggested someone had taken care to remove objects that could identify her or reveal what she saw. For the first time since the search ended, the case surged forward. The file, once stagnant, now brimmed with new urgency. The canyon, once silent, now offered its first clue, and a question that had hung in the air for months took on a darker shape. Who placed Rachel Monroe high in a Joshua tree, and how had that person moved through the desert without leaving a trace? The discovery didn't answer the question. It sharpened it, and it reawakened the entire investigation. When the coroner's van pulled away from the base of that cliff, the story of Rachel Monroe's disappearance entered a different phase. For 4 months, investigators had been working inside a mystery, with no body, no crime scene, and no way to say with certainty what had happened. Now they had all three if they could learn how to read them. The remains were taken to the Clark County Coroner's Office, where Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Elaine Porter, in her mid-50s and experienced with desert deaths, began the painstaking work of examination. The Mojave is brutal on the human body. Extreme heat, UV exposure, and scavengers all leave their marks. But bones keep their own record. Within hours, Dr. Porter could say one thing with certainty: this was no hiking accident. Skeletal analysis showed a distinct fracture of the hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck. That fracture pattern is not associated with falls or natural causes. It is strongly linked to manual strangulation. Several ribs showed hairline fractures that, based on healing and coloration, had occurred at or around the time of death. The pattern was inconsistent with a single impact, like a tumble down a slope. It looked more like blunt force trauma during a struggle. Then came the question of the tree. Studying the way the joints and limbs were positioned, Dr. Porter concluded that Rachel's body had been placed in the branches after death, rather than thrown or caught there during a fall. There were no secondary fractures that would match a high-impact collision with the tree. No scrapes or breaks one would expect from a violent landing among twisted limbs. Instead, the placement suggested deliberate, controlled movement, a person using strength, leverage, and likely rope to lodge a body 18 feet off the ground. Her official conclusion: homicide by manual strangulation with evidence of assault and post-mortem staging. For Detective Samuel Pike, that report changed everything. The file that had once been labeled Missing Person Unknown Circumstances now became a homicide case. And the lonely Joshua tree in that hidden corridor was no longer just a landmark. It was a crime scene. Pike brought the crime scene team back to the canyon this time, treating the entire area around the tree as a primary site. Officer Dana Liu, the climber who had first reached the body, returned to assist with technical access. Investigators expanded their perimeter, moving out in measured circles with metal detectors, evidence flags, and cameras. 200 yards from the Joshua tree in a shallow ravine, they found the first critical piece, a shattered camera body. The DSLR was heavily damaged, its LCD screen fractured, its lens mount broken clean away. It did not look like a camera that had simply been dropped. It looked like something that had been struck repeatedly or smashed against rock. More telling, the memory card slot was empty. Whoever had handled that camera had taken the time to remove the most important part, the record of what it had seen. The discovery changed the search pattern. If the camera had been discarded, their other items might have been hidden more carefully. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, the team began a systematic sweep of the surrounding slopes. Hours later, beneath a carefully arranged pile of rocks in a location that blended naturally into the terrain, they found her backpack. It was buried deliberately. The rocks were not part of a natural wash pattern. They'd been placed. Inside the pack were Rachel's wallet, personal items, and crucially, her car keys. The tripod, additional lenses, and water bottles mentioned by her roommate were missing. The keys told Pike something important. Rachel had not simply wandered off and collapsed. Her killer had left her car parked neatly at the visitor lot with the keys buried miles away. That choice likely delayed the alarm and bought time. Her phone, retrieved from the backpack, was in poor shape. Its screen spiderwebbed, its internals corroded from moisture. At first glance, it looked like a dead piece of plastic and metal, useless after months in the ground. But in the hands of digital forensic specialists, even damaged phones can talk. Technicians painstakingly extracted what remained of the internal memory, focusing on location data. What they recovered would become the backbone of the entire reconstruction. The GPS log traced Rachel's path on the morning of August 12th. It showed her car at the visitor center. Then her phone moving along the main trail for roughly a mile, consistent with the family's sighting and the route she had planned. Then, at a certain point, an abrupt deviation. Her path cut away from the established trail and into the unmarked desert. The coordinates mapped a complex route, nearly 2 miles of movement into rough terrain, with several stops and direction changes looping around ridges and through narrow corridors. It was not the pattern of someone wandering in confusion or panic. It suggested purpose, or at least direction, imposed from outside. Then, just after a cluster of points that placed her within half a mile of where her body would later be found, the tracking ended. No gradual loss of signal, no slow fade into weak connectivity. The phone simply stopped transmitting. To Pike and the technical team, it looked less like the phone had failed, and more like it had been deliberately disabled. The GPS path gave investigators their first clear picture. Rachel had left the main trail in the company of someone who knew exactly where they were going. That person had led or forced her into one of the least traveled parts of the canyon, silenced her phone near the end of the journey, and later staged her body in a tree that required climbing skill to reach. Whoever did this had knowledge of the terrain, physical strength, technical ability, and enough experience to conceal evidence in ways that had kept search teams blind for months. Pike and his team began building a profile. This was likely not a casual visitor or a spur-of-the-moment encounter. It pointed to someone who spent significant time in Red Rock Canyon, knew cross-country routes beyond marked trails, possessed climbing skills and equipment, felt comfortable moving in remote areas without attracting attention. That narrowed the field to a specific group: climbing guides, outdoor instructors, researchers, maintenance crews, and photographers with special permits. Pike requested a full audit of every permit, registration, and work authorization granted for the canyon in the weeks surrounding Rachel's disappearance. The list was long: commercial tour operators, wilderness educators, scientific teams, film crews. But when his analysts cross-referenced those permits with the sector where Rachel's body was found, one name appeared repeatedly: Eric Dalton. Dalton, 39, was listed as a freelance wilderness photographer and part-time climbing guide. He held multiple permits granting access to restricted and remote areas of the park. His paperwork placed him in and around the same sector as the Joshua Tree during the week of Rachel's disappearance. A background check showed no criminal record. But Pike was less interested in convictions than in complaints. With help from consumer databases, he found several Better Business Bureau and online reviews referencing Dalton's work. The pattern was disturbing. Female clients described uncomfortable experiences during private sessions. Dalton's insistence on isolated shoot locations, far from marked trails, personal comments about their appearance and a tendency to push deeper into the wilderness than they had expected. Nothing in these accounts had triggered a criminal investigation at the time, but collectively they painted a picture of someone who used his professional role to place women in vulnerable situations. Pike decided Dalton could not be approached casually. Surveillance came first. For several days, an undercover team watched Dalton's small apartment in Henderson and followed his Jeep Wrangler into and out of the canyon. The vehicle, heavily modified with roof racks and gear mounts, was often parked at remote access points, service roads, unmarked pull-offs, trailheads far from the main visitor loop. From a distance, what he did looked like work leading clients into the desert, setting up tripods, positioning them against dramatic backdrops. But when investigators watched closely, they saw a consistent preference for young women, often alone, or with minimal support, and a habit of steering them into isolated corridors and washes. During one surveillance session, Dalton left his Jeep unlocked while he led a client to a distant ridge. Using a long-lens camera from a concealed position, investigators photographed the interior of the vehicle. In the back, they saw climbing gear, coil after coil of rope, and a heavy professional-grade tripod that matched the description of the one Rachel had carried into the canyon, but which had never been recovered from the scene. Combined with his permit records, it was enough for probable cause. Pike obtained a search warrant. The operation was timed for early morning, when Dalton would most likely be home and disoriented by the sudden presence of law enforcement. SWAT and detectives moved in together, securing the apartment and the Jeep simultaneously. Dalton appeared shocked, but not confused. When told he was under arrest in connection with the death of Rachel Monroe, his first instinct was not to demand an explanation. It was to ask for a lawyer. He refused to answer questions about his activities in August 2016. Inside the apartment yielded the kind of evidence investigators hope for but rarely find. In a closet, neatly stored, were camera lenses in cases labeled with names. One case carried a strip of tape with R. Monroe written on it. Hidden behind a false panel in Dalton's desk, detectives found a stack of memory cards, each from different cameras. Among them was the missing card from Rachel's destroyed DSLR, later confirmed by serial numbers. Then they found the journal. It was not a diary in the traditional sense, but a meticulous set of notes, dates, locations, descriptions of women encountered in desert settings. Dalton had written about their ages, clothing behaviors, and how comfortable they appeared in the wilderness. Some entries evaluated potential in chillingly clinical terms. The entry about Rachel, written several days before she vanished, stood out. He described her as a graduate photography student, noted her equipment, and observed that she often worked alone in early morning light. He referenced their interactions on a photography forum, how she had asked for advice on shooting Red Rock Canyon, and how he had suggested remote spots away from tourists. One line in particular pulled the air out of the room, a note that Rachel was perfect, serious about her work, comfortable solo, likely to wander deeper, and that she would not be noticed missing right away. The journal, combined with the lenses and memory card, moved the case from strong suspicion to overwhelming implication. But investigators still needed to tie Dalton physically to the killing. Forensic teams processed his Jeep from bumper to bumper. Swabs from the passenger seat and door handles revealed DNA that matched Rachel Monroe. Additional traces drawn from other parts of the interior belonged to at least 2 unidentified women. Those profiles were entered into national databases. No immediate matches came back. In the rear compartment, alongside carabiners and hardware technicians, found a coil of climbing rope and specialized anchors. Microscopic analysis of the rope fibers showed traces of plant material consistent with Joshua tree bark. The anchors were of the type used to secure rigging systems that could raise heavy loads like a human body into elevated positions. Then came the phone records. Cell tower data from August 12, 2016 showed Dalton's phone active in Red Rock Canyon that morning, traveling a route that closely mirrored the GPS path extracted from Rachel's damaged device. Timestamps placed him in the same sector of the canyon at the same times her phone recorded movement, and at the moment it stopped transmitting. Finally, digital forensics experts examined the memory cards seized from his apartment. There were hundreds of photographs, women in desert landscapes, many taken from a distance, as if the subjects weren't aware they were being watched. Some images showed women clearly distressed or disoriented in remote areas. Others appeared to have been taken from cover using telephoto lenses. On one card, the one identified as Rachel's, investigators found the last photographs she had taken sunrise light on canyon walls, empty trails, red and gold stone. Then the perspective shifted. The next series of images were of Rachel herself, walking along the Calico Trail, then moving off it. The angle indicated that someone behind her using a long lens had been tracking her. Frame by frame, she moved farther from the marked path and deeper into rough terrain. The final photographs placed her in the general area where her body would later be found, still apparently unaware of the camera pointed at her from afar. There were no photos of the attack itself, but the sequence demonstrated premeditation. Dalton had followed her, documented her movements, and chosen his moment when she was completely isolated. For Pike, the pieces now formed a harsh, coherent picture. As the scope of Dalton's behavior became clearer, the investigation widened beyond Rachel's case. Pike reached out to agencies in Nevada, Arizona, and California, asking for unsolved cases involving young women who had vanished while hiking painting or doing field work in desert parks. Two stood out. In 2014, a 29-year-old landscape painter named Lauren Pierce disappeared while working in Joshua Tree National Park. Her car was found in a lot. Her art supplies never surfaced. Her body was never recovered. Records showed that Dalton had conducted photography workshops in the same park and time frame. In 2015, a 25-year-old geology student named Erin McKay vanished while collecting field data in Valley of Fire State Park. Her research equipment was found scattered and damaged across a wide area. 6 months later, her body was discovered in a location that required technical climbing skills to reach positioned in a way that did not match accidental death. No charges were filed in those earlier cases, at least not yet, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. Then came a call from a retired Red Rock Ranger named Harold Hal Jenkins. He had read about Dalton's arrest in the paper and recognized the name immediately. Jenkins had kept personal notes from his years in the canyon incidents that never rose to the level of full reports, but had troubled him. In 3 separate cases, women had reported a man with a camera following them on remote trails, making them uncomfortable or trying to lure them to more isolated locations under the guise of better light. One college student from Utah said she escaped to a busier viewpoint when he wouldn't stop taking her picture. A professional photographer from Colorado terminated a guided shoot early because he seemed more interested in her than the job. A local woman left a trailhead after he insisted they hike several miles into rough terrain for portraits she hadn't asked for. In that last incident, she had written down his license plate. It matched Dalton's Jeep. Jenkins had confronted him at the time and issued a warning. No law had technically been broken, so no charges followed. Now those old notes became part of the prosecutorial narrative, a documented pattern of escalation. Investigators also tore through Dalton's online presence. Under various business names and social media handles, he promoted himself as an expert desert guide and photographer. His messages to potential clients, especially women new to the Southwest or visiting alone, often emphasized secluded locations away from the crowds and secret spots that only locals know. Reviewing those messages, Pike's team found a thread on a photography forum, Rachel's post asking for advice on capturing Red Rock Canyon, and Dalton's responses. He had been aware of her work, her schedule, and her plan to shoot the canyon in the early morning. He had recommended specific areas near where she was ultimately killed as ideal for serious landscape work. From that point forward, the reconstruction solidified. According to the timeline, prosecutors would later present Dalton identified Rachel as a target weeks before she vanished. He studied her posts, assessed her habits, and knew she preferred to work alone at dawn. On August 12th, he positioned himself in the park before she arrived, followed her at a distance along the main trail, and then approached or intercepted her when no one else was near. The GPS path showed the route he forced her to walk away from the marked trail across difficult ground, deeper into a sector of the canyon few people ever enter. At some point near the end of that path, he disabled her phone. Forensic evidence indicated he strangled her, inflicted additional trauma to her ribs, then used his climbing gear and knowledge of the rock to hoist her body into the branches of the Joshua tree. He removed her camera's memory card, smashed the body, buried her backpack with keys and phone under rocks, and left her car in the parking lot so it would appear for as long as possible that she was simply still out hiking. Then he went back to his life, continuing to sell himself as a guide and photographer in the same desert he used as a hunting ground. With physical evidence, digital records, witness accounts, prior incident reports, and Dalton's own writings, the picture was, in the words of one investigator, as complete as we ever get in real life. 3 days after his arrest, following a comprehensive review of the file, the Clark County District Attorney's Office filed formal charges against Eric Dalton, first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence in the death of Rachel Monroe. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, citing the planning involved, the deliberate cruelty of the staging, and the emerging pattern of similar cases. For Rachel's family, the cost of the truth had been nearly unbearable. A year of uncertainty, 4 months of not knowing if she was alive or dead, and then the knowledge that her final hours had played out in a way no parent should ever have to imagine. For detectives like Samuel Pike, there was no satisfaction, only resolution. The lines on the map now connected. The timestamps aligned. The last movements of a careful, capable woman had been reconstructed from fragments of data and the arrogance of the man who believed he could move through the desert unseen. The case would now leave the hands of investigators and enter the courtroom where 12 jurors would be asked to weigh all of it and decide what justice meant for Rachel Monroe. When the trial of Eric Dalton opened in the Clark County Courthouse, nearly a year had passed since the morning Rachel Monroe carried her camera into the desert. The courtroom felt still heavy, its quiet interrupted only by the shuffle of attorneys and the occasional creak of the wooden benches. Spectators ranged from fellow hikers and local photographers to former students who had once sat in Rachel's classroom. Many had followed the case since August, when she vanished without a trace. They returned now to witness its end. Prosecutors presented their case with a methodical calm, walking jurors through the evidence the way investigators had once walked the canyon, slowly, deliberately knowing the terrain mattered. They showed the jury the fractures on Rachel's bones, the smashed camera, and the GPS trail that mapped her final movements. They displayed the memory card recovered from Dalton's desk evidence of his decision to remove the one piece of technology that could have shown what Rachel saw before she died. Jurors listened to testimony from digital analysts, forensic pathologists, climbing experts, and seasoned detectives. They heard about the rope fibers matching Joshua tree bark, Rachel's DNA found inside Dalton's Jeep, and the notes he had written describing her as an ideal subject. They learned that he had used his skill in the canyon not as a guide or artist, but as a predator who understood which stretches of land erased human presence and which hours on the clock left victims unseen. Dalton never took the stand. He never offered an explanation. His attorneys argued circumstantial interpretation suggested alternative scenarios and questioned the reliability of desert forensics. But in the end, the evidence pointed in a single direction toward intention, preparation, and control. After deliberating less than 2 days, the jury returned unanimous convictions for first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. During the penalty phase, prosecutors emphasized the planning involved and the deliberate placement of Rachel's body. The jurors, citing the aggravated nature of the crime and the defendant's predatory pattern, recommended the death penalty. The judge upheld the recommendation. Dalton was later transferred to Ely State Prison, where he remains on death row. For Rachel's parents, Tom and Marjorie Monroe, the verdict brought an end to the long suspended silence that had defined their lives for more than a year. Yet closure is a complicated word in families of homicide victims. Relief and grief live side by side. The truth fills the void where uncertainty once lived, but it does not bring back the daughter who vanished into the sunrise. They attended every day of the trial. They sat quietly, hands clasped as photographs from the canyon appeared on large screens, images of terrain. Rachel once admired, now displayed as evidence in a courtroom. When the verdict was read, Marjorie wept softly and Tom placed his hand over hers, steadying both of them in a moment that felt final but not healing. Later, when speaking briefly outside the courthouse, they did not express triumph or anger. They spoke instead about bearing witness to their daughter's life, to the work investigators had done, and to the way strangers across Nevada had helped search for her when she first went missing. They thanked the community, the climbing instructor who made the key discovery, and the detectives who refused to abandon the case. But they did not speak of forgiveness. Some losses remain untouched by that word. Within the broader community, Rachel's case changed more than a single narrative about a missing hiker. It altered the way people understood the desert, the way search operations were managed, and the way outdoor guides were vetted. Red Rock Canyon instituted new requirements for private instructors and photographers, including background checks and stricter permit oversight. Rangers expanded training on early detection of suspicious behavior in backcountry areas, something that old Ranger Hal Jenkins, now retired, said he wished had existed years earlier. Search and rescue teams revised their protocols as well. Rachel's disappearance had highlighted a problem long recognized, but rarely discussed: the delay created by an undisturbed car in a parking lot. Investigators adopted new measures for documenting vehicles associated with overdue hikers, checking timestamps on permits more frequently, and encouraging visitors to register solo hikes at the visitor center. For outdoor communities across the Southwest, the case was a somber reminder that experience, preparation, and familiarity with the land cannot always protect against human danger. Hiking groups added safety briefings to their websites. Photographers shared guidelines for signaling trouble during remote shoots. Women, especially those who worked in isolated environments, formed new networks for checking in during early morning fieldwork. Rachel's colleagues at Desert State University established an annual photography scholarship in her name, the Monroe Visual Arts Fellowship, awarded to students who pursue landscape and environmental work. Each year, recipients gather beneath the canyon's red cliffs to reflect on her passion for light color and the way the desert tells its own story. A plaque near the Calico trailhead now bears her name, a quiet marker in a place she once loved. For investigators, the conclusion of the trial brought its own form of reflection. Detective Samuel Pike, who had shepherded the case from Rachel's first disappearance to the final verdict, often said that solving the crime did not feel like victory. It felt like duty, an obligation not to allow the canyon's silence to win. He knew the evidence had created a clear picture, but unanswered questions still lingered at the margins. Had Dalton harmed others whose disappearances were never tied to him? How long had he been using the desert as a hunting ground? And what might have happened if the climbing instructor on that cold December morning had not looked twice at the Joshua tree? Some questions Pike knew would never find resolution. The investigative file closed with a thick stack of evidence and a single-sheet summary at the front: case solved. Offender convicted, status sentenced. But the emotional remnants, those belonged to families, co-workers, and the landscape itself. On the anniversary of Rachel's disappearance, her parents returned to Red Rock Canyon. They didn't climb into the remote section where her body had been found. That area remained closed during ongoing environmental surveys. Instead, they visited the marked trail she had walked that morning. They paused at the point where the sun crested the ridge where she likely captured her final peaceful images before crossing into the unseen terrain beyond. They left a single desert marigold at the base of a sandstone shelf, not as a memorial to the violence she suffered, but as a tribute to the beauty she sought. And then, after standing for a long moment in the dry morning breeze, they walked back toward the trailhead. Step by step, they moved toward their car, toward a home that felt different now, yet still theirs to carry forward. Rachel's story does not end neatly. True stories rarely do. But it leaves behind a legacy, a reminder of how a community can rally, how investigators can persist, and how a single discovery can pull the truth out of the shadows. It honors a woman whose life was defined not by the way it ended, but by the work and passion she brought into the world. In the desert that once concealed her light breaks differently now. The canyon remembers. And for those who searched, who grieved, and who insisted the truth still mattered, her name remains steady, etched not into stone, but into the collective memory of the community she left behind.